The whiteboard on the shop wall had 4 names written next to the number 10, and all 4 were waiting on panels that hadn't been cut yet. A flatbed backed toward the stacked rows outside, brakes hissing, gravel crunching under the tires. Elias Marsh checked the tag on the nearest row, 8 foot, batch 11, and waved the driver in closer. 2 farmhands climbed down and started loading panels, while Elias crossed names off the board one at a time. None of them knew, or particularly cared, that every panel on that truck had started life as a bent, rusted cattle gate that a farm auction had once been desperate to get rid of. They just knew the panels worked, stacked clean, and showed up on time. 2 years earlier, nobody in Callaway County would have believed that sentence. 2 years earlier, Elias had been standing behind a livestock barn at Bell's auction, looking at the ugliest pile of scrap metal he'd ever bid on in his life. The Bell family had run cattle on that land for 3 generations, and when the last of them decided to retire and lease the pasture out, they auctioned off everything that wasn't nailed down. Feeders went first, then a couple of stock trailers, then an old squeeze chute that a rancher from 2 counties over paid too much for out of nostalgia. By early afternoon, the auctioneer, a wiry man named Hollis Judd, had worked his way down to the parts of the sale nobody wanted to think about. "Last lot of the day," Hollis said, nodding toward a heap piled up behind the barn. "Ruly 200 cattle gates, sold as one lot, buyer hauls everything." The crowd shifted to look, and a few people laughed before Hollis even opened the bidding. The gates were stacked crooked, rusted through in places, bent at angles no gate was ever supposed to bend. Some still had hinges hanging loose and useless. Others had no hinges at all, just jagged holes where the hardware used to be. Different widths, different heights, different colors of chipped paint. The whole pile looked less like farm equipment and more like something waiting for a crusher. "You buying scrap by the acre now, Hollis?" Someone called out, and a ripple of laughter followed. Hollis opened at $200. Nobody moved. He dropped to $150, then $100, and still the crowd just watched, arms crossed, waiting for someone else to make the mistake first. Elias stood near the back with his Uncle Ray, who ran a small cattle operation on leased ground about 10 minutes from the Bell place. Elias worked part-time at a welding shop in town, and most weekends he helped Ray move cattle, mend fence, and patch whatever had broken that week on equipment held together by baling wire and stubbornness. He'd looked at that pile of gates longer than anyone else standing around him, and something about the shapes kept pulling his attention even as people around him kept joking. Hollis dropped the price again. $80, he said, sounding like a man ready to give up on the lot entirely and just have someone haul it off for free. Elias raised his hand before he'd fully worked out why. The laughter started almost immediately. $80 for 200 headaches, a heavy-set man near the front said, shaking his head. "Better bring a long trailer, son," someone else added. Ray didn't laugh, but he didn't look thrilled either. He just watched his nephew with the kind of expression that said he'd ask about it later, in private, where the whole county couldn't hear the answer. Nobody bid against him. Hollis brought the gavel down, and just like that, Elias owned 200 bent, rusted, mismatched cattle gates for $80. The laughter followed him all the way to his truck. The first real problem showed up before he'd sold a single thing. $80 had bought him the gates, but it hadn't bought him a way to move them. His own truck bed could barely hold 15 at a time, stacked carefully and strapped down, and even then the drive back to Ray's property felt like it took twice as long as it should have. He ended up borrowing a flatbed trailer from a friend of Ray's, making trip after trip over 2 full weekends, loading and unloading gates by hand until his palms were raw and his back ached in ways he hadn't expected from metal that looked lighter than it actually was. By the time the last load was stacked behind Ray's equipment shed, Elias had a clearer understanding of something nobody at the auction had bothered to mention out loud. The $80 price tag was the cheapest part of the whole transaction. Ray stood looking at the pile one evening after the last trip, hands on his hips. "You spent more on fuel in my friend's diesel than you spent on the gates themselves," Ray said. "I know," Elias answered. "So what exactly is the plan here?" Elias didn't have a clean answer yet, and Ray's silence afterward said plenty about what he thought of that. The plan Elias landed on first seemed reasonable enough on paper. He would sort through the pile, Pick out the gates that weren't too far gone. Straighten what needed straightening. Patch the hinges and sell them as regular used cattle gates. He spent most evenings that first month at it, using tools borrowed from the welding shop where he worked, with his boss's permission to use the equipment after hours, heating bent sections with a torch and hammering them back toward square, replacing missing hinge pins, grinding rust off wherever it had eaten through the paint. He picked his best dozen gates, cleaned them up as best he could, and posted them for sale at a price a little below what new gates cost. A few sold. One buyer, a small farmer named Otis Bramlett, came back 2 weeks later holding the gate he'd bought, clearly annoyed. "This thing won't hang square," Otis said, setting it against the side of his truck. "I mounted it exactly like a normal gate, and it drags on the low corner every time." Elias apologized, refunded part of the price, and took the gate back to look at later. And that was when the real problem started to sink in. Every gate in that pile had its own personality, its own bend, its own rust pattern, its own hinge spacing that didn't quite match anything standard. Restoring each one back to its original identity as a swinging, hanging gate meant treating every single piece like its own custom repair job, and custom repair on 200 pieces of bent steel was never going to pay for itself. He did the math one night sitting on an overturned bucket in Ray's equipment shed, and the numbers were ugly. Hours of labor per gate, low resale price, thin margin, and a customer complaint on top of it. For a few days, Elias seriously considered calling it a loss and hauling the rest to a scrap buyer just to be done with it. Then, almost by accident, something changed his thinking. Ray needed to separate a handful of calves from their mothers for a few days before weaning, and the temporary pen he usually cobbled together with cattle panels wasn't going to be ready in time. "Grab a couple of those gates from your pile," Ray said, nodding toward the stack behind the shed. "We just need something to keep them apart for a few days, not a museum piece." Elias pulled 2 of the worst-looking gates from the reject side of the pile, the ones bent too badly to ever hang square again, and he and Ray wired them between fence posts to form a rough barrier. The calves pushed against it a few times that first evening, testing it the way calves test everything. The wired-together gates held. They looked terrible, crooked, mismatched, patched with wire in 3 places, but they held. Elias stood there for a long moment after the calves settled down, looking at those 2 ugly frames doing exactly the job they needed to do. It hit him slowly, the way real ideas usually do, instead of all at once like it happens in the stories people tell later. The calves didn't care whether that frame could swing on a hinge. They cared whether it was strong enough to stand between them and where they wanted to go. He had been trying to repair gates this whole time, when what the pile actually contained wasn't 200 broken gates. It was 200 welded steel frames, already shaped roughly the way livestock barriers needed to be shaped, already built out of tubing strong enough to take pressure from an animal leaning into it. The value had never been in the swinging mechanism. The value was in the frame itself. That night, Elias went back through the pile with a completely different eye. Instead of asking which gates could be restored to hang correctly, he started asking which frames were straight enough, strong enough, and close enough in size to become something else entirely, something that didn't need to swing at all. Over the following weeks, he worked out a rough process on his own workbench, using skills he'd picked up at the welding shop but had never applied quite this way before. He cut off the ruined hinge sections instead of trying to repair them. He trimmed damaged ends down to clean, usable steel. He straightened only the bends that mattered structurally, leaving smaller dents and old paint exactly as they were, since none of that affected strength. He welded simple flat feet onto the bottom of each frame so it could stand upright on its own during setup, without needing a post to lean against. The feet held a single panel steady while it was being positioned, but the real strength came once panels were linked together, since the connector system let a whole line of them brace one another the moment the pen was fully assembled. He added a basic connector to each end, a welded loop on one side, a drop-in pin on the other, so 2 frames could link together quickly without tools. He ground down every sharp edge until nothing was left that could cut an animal or a person handling it. What came off his workbench didn't look new, and it didn't try to. It looked exactly like what it was, a repurposed gate frame, scratched and mismatched in color, but straight where it needed to be straight and solid where it needed to be solid. He built 6 of them that first batch and drove them out to a small sheep and goat operation run by a woman named Carol Yount, who Ray had mentioned was always short on portable fencing during lambing season. Carol looked over the panels with the kind of skepticism Elias was getting used to by then. "These used to be gates," she said, more statement than question, running a hand along one welded connector. "Most of them," Elias said. "They don't swing anymore, but they'll hold a barrier line just fine." Carol offered to test them for 1 lambing pen instead of committing to anything bigger, which was more than fair given that nobody had ever tried to sell her anything quite like this before. The panels held through 2 full weeks of lambing season without a single failure, penning ewes and lambs exactly the way she needed, connector to connector, standing on their own without posts or wire. Carol paid him for the 6 panels, and a month later she called asking for 6 more. That was the first real proof, small as it was, and it was enough for Elias to stop thinking of himself as a man trying to repair old gates and start thinking of himself as a man building something new out of old material. He settled on 3 standard sizes after some trial and error: 6-foot, 8-foot, and 10-foot panels, sorted by whatever usable length each original frame could reasonably be trimmed and straightened into. The connector system stayed simple on purpose. The same welded loop and drop pin on every single panel regardless of size, so a farmer could link a 6-footer to a 10-footer without thinking twice about it. That interchangeability turned out to matter more than Elias expected, since farmers rarely needed exactly one size for exactly one purpose. They needed pieces that could be rearranged depending on whatever problem showed up that week. Word moved the way it usually does in farming country. Slow at first, carried mostly by people who'd actually seen the panels holding livestock rather than by anything Elias said about them himself. A cattle farmer 2 roads over bought 8 panels for a temporary calving setup after Ray mentioned what his nephew had been building. A family raising show goats for the county fair bought 10 for a portable sorting pen, since new portable panels from the farm supply catalog cost more than 3 times what Elias was charging for the same basic function. By the end of that first year, Elias had sold close to 60 panels out of the original pile, and the reject portion, the frames too rusted or too badly damaged to trust, sat in a separate stack waiting for a scrap buyer to eventually haul away. Not every gate in that pile had been worth saving, and Elias had learned early to accept that rather than fight it. The panels that survived his process, though, were starting to build a reputation of their own, ugly and mismatched as they looked standing in a row. Going into the second year, demand outpaced what the original 200 gates could supply, and Elias had to start thinking about where the next batch of damaged frames would come from. He found a fencing contractor near the county line who regularly pulled old gates off properties during upgrade jobs and had nowhere useful to put them. He found a livestock auction barn 2 counties over that occasionally cleared out damaged equipment lots the same way Bell's had. He learned, gate lot by gate lot, which sources tended to have usable steel and which tended to be mostly rust, and he stopped buying everything just because it was cheap, since cheap material that couldn't be trusted wasn't actually cheap once you counted the labor wasted sorting through it. That discipline mattered more than he realized at the time, because it was about to get tested in a way that cost him real money. Late that summer, a regional cattle producer preparing for a large sale event needed 40 panels on a tight deadline for temporary sorting pens. It was the biggest single order Elias had taken on, more than double anything he'd built before, and he didn't have 40 good frames sitting ready in his usual stock. He had 30 solid ones, and a stack of borderline frames from a recent batch that he'd been planning to inspect more carefully before deciding what to do with them. He told himself the borderline frames just needed a little extra reinforcement, an extra weld here, a doubled-up brace there, and that would be enough to bring them up to standard. He knew, even as he was telling himself that some of those frames had tubing thinner than what he normally accepted, weakened by rust from the inside in a way that didn't always show on the surface. But the deadline was close, the order was large, and turning away that much business felt like exactly the kind of mistake a smaller operation couldn't afford to make. So he built the last 10 panels out of the questionable frames, reinforced as best he could, and delivered the full order on schedule. 3 days later, his phone rang. It was the producer, and he wasn't happy. During a sorting operation, one of the reinforced panels had buckled under pressure from a group of cattle pushing against the temporary line, and several animals had gotten loose into an open field before the crew managed to gather them back up. Nobody was hurt, animal or person, but the crew had lost most of an afternoon rounding up cattle that should have stayed contained, and a section of the producer's own permanent fence had been damaged when the animals pushed through it, trying to get back to pasture. Elias drove out that same day to look at the failed panel himself. The break was clean and told him everything he needed to know. The tubing had been thinner than it should have been, weakened from the inside by rust he hadn't caught, and no amount of reinforcement welding on the outside had been enough to compensate for what had already rotted away underneath. He had known that batch of frames was worse than his usual material, and he had used them anyway because the order was too big to turn down. That was on him, and he didn't try to explain it any other way to the producer standing in front of him. He replaced all 10 questionable panels at his own cost, refunded a portion of the total order, and paid out of pocket to help repair the section of damaged fence. It cost him most of what he'd earned from the job in the first place, and it cost him something harder to get back. The producer didn't call again for the rest of that season, and word of the failure moved through the same channels that had carried his early success. A couple of farmers who'd been considering their first order decided to wait and see. For a few weeks, Elias came closer to giving up than he had at any point since the auction. But sitting with the failure instead of running from it forced him toward the hardest lesson of the whole business, one that mattered more than anything he'd figured out before it. A panel could look rough on the outside and still be perfectly strong, the same way those first 2 wired-together gates in Ray's calf pen had looked terrible and held anyway. But the reverse was just as true, and just as dangerous. A panel could look fine and still be dangerously weak underneath if the steel itself had rotted from the inside. Appearance had never told him anything reliable about strength in either direction, and he had let a deadline talk him into ignoring that. He needed a real standard, not a gut feeling, for deciding which incoming frames were worth processing and which needed to go straight to the scrap pile. He built one over the following month, simple enough to apply quickly, but strict enough to actually mean something. Every incoming gate got a visual inspection first, checking for deep corrosion, cracked weld zones, and crushed sections along the rails. He started tapping suspect tubing with a wrench, listening for the dull, dead sound that meant rot underneath instead of the sharper ring of solid steel. He measured wall thickness on anything that seemed borderline instead of guessing, and anything that fell below his minimum got set aside for scrap without exception, no matter how badly he needed the frame that week. Frames that passed went through cutting, straightening, and welding the same way as before, but now every finished batch got a load test before it left the shop. A handful of sample panels pushed and leaned on hard enough to catch a weak weld or a bad joint before a customer ever saw it. Around the same time, Elias built a simple steel jig on his workbench, something he should have built months earlier if he'd thought that far ahead. Instead of measuring every frame from scratch and guessing where the connectors should land, he set the frame into the jig, trimmed the damaged end to a fixed mark, and welded the connector loop and pin in the exact same position every single time. Feet landed in the same spot on every panel, connectors lined up the same way on every panel, and a job that used to depend on careful individual measurement turned into something closer to repeatable manufacturing. Consistency showed up almost immediately in the finished product, and it showed up in how much faster he could move through a batch without sacrificing anything on quality. Rebuilding trust took longer than rebuilding the process had. Elias went back to the cattle producer himself that fall, not to ask for another order, just to show him the new inspection standards and the load testing routine he'd put in place since the failure. The producer listened, arms crossed, clearly still cautious. "You should have had this in the first place," the producer said. "I should have," Elias agreed, and didn't try to argue his way around it. It took the better part of a year before that particular customer placed another order, but when he finally did, it was for more panels than the first time, and he mentioned the load testing routine specifically as the reason he'd decided to come back. By the third year, the business Elias was running looked almost nothing like the man standing behind Bell's barn with the bidder number in his hand. He'd moved out of Ray's equipment shed and into a small rented workshop on the edge of town, with 2 part-time workers helping cut, weld, and load panels during the busiest stretches of the season. Multiple supply sources kept a steady stream of damaged frames coming in: the fencing contractor near the county line, the auction barn 2 counties over, and a growing list of ranches replacing old handling systems who now called Elias directly instead of hauling their old gates to scrap themselves. Not everything that came in got processed, and the reject pile behind the shop stayed a permanent fixture, a reminder that standardization only worked because some materials simply didn't qualify. By then, the shop was turning out several dozen finished panels during a strong production week, moving through cut, straighten, weld, and load test in a steady rhythm that would have been impossible back when every frame was measured and welded from scratch. Revenue that third year settled at a little over $300,000, built mostly from panel sales, with a smaller share coming from delivery fees and connector kits, sold separately to customers expanding their own existing setups. That number wasn't profit, and Elias tracked the difference as carefully as he tracked incoming steel, since acquisition costs, hauling fuel, welding gas, replacement tubing, grinding discs, shop rent, insurance, and labor for his 2 workers all came out of that figure before anything counted as his own. What was left over was real, steady, and earned the same slow way as everything else in the business: 1 inspected frame, 1 welded panel, 1 satisfied customer at a time. One afternoon that fall, a familiar truck pulled up outside the shop, and Elias recognized the driver before the man had even climbed out. It was the same heavyset farmer who'd called out about scrap by the acre back at Bell's auction 2 years earlier, a man named Dale Kesslers, who ran a mid-sized operation on the far side of the county. Dale walked slowly along the rows of finished panels, reading the size markings stenciled on the end of each row: 6 foot, 8 foot, 10 foot, most of them already tagged with a customer's name. "You got any 10s left?" Dale asked, not quite meeting Elias's eyes. "Next batch is spoken for," Elias said, checking the whiteboard. "When's the batch after that?" Dale asked. Elias told him, wrote his name down on the board without comment, and Dale nodded once before heading back to his truck. No apology passed between them, and none was needed. That same week, Hollis Judd, the auctioneer who'd sold Elias the original lot for $80, stopped by the shop on his way through town for another sale. He walked along the rows slower than Dale had, running a hand over the mismatched paint on one of the older panels near the end of a row. "These came out of Bell's auction, didn't they?" Hollis said, more observation than question. "Some of them," Elias answered. Hollis nodded, looked at the reject pile of corroded scrap sitting off to the side, then back at the neat standardized rows stretching out from the shop door. He didn't say anything else about it, and Elias didn't offer anything more than what he'd already said. He just went back to loading the next order onto a waiting flatbed, 1 panel at a time, connector to connector, exactly the way they'd been designed to fit. At home, the changes were smaller but steady in the same way the business itself had grown. Ray's old cattle lease finally started running comfortably in the black instead of barely breaking even, thanks partly to a full set of Elias's panels replacing the wire and scrap lumber setups they used to cobble together every calving season. The family pickup got its transmission repaired that second year, no longer something Elias's mother had to worry about every time she needed to drive it into town. He finished his welding certification not long after, less because the business required the paper and more because he wanted the proof of something he'd already learned the hard way: 1 bent frame at a time. None of it happened all at once, and none of it made anyone in the family rich, but the pressure that used to sit over the household eased off gradually, the same way it always does when steady work finally replaces uncertain work. Behind the shop that evening, the last of the day's orders rolled out on a flatbed, panels stacked and strapped exactly the way Elias had learned to stack them after that first brutal weekend hauling gates out of Bell's barn. The reject pile sat where it always sat, corroded and waiting for the scrap buyer's next visit, a quiet reminder that not everything in that original pile had been worth saving. But the standardized rows stretching along the fence line told the rest of the story. 6 foot, 8 foot, 10 foot, tagged and ready, built out of 200 gates that an entire county had once laughed at behind a barn nobody wanted to look at twice.